Hey, got another sermon for you. This is a sermon that was delivered on a special day of Thanksgiving that had been called by the governor of Louisiana. Thanksgiving wasn't an actual holiday in the United States except by occasional presidential decree until 1863 when Lincoln tried to make it one. Grant made it into one in the 1870s. It was delivered by Mr. Benjamin Morgan Palmer at the First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans. He was the pastor of that church for 46 years. The church had begun in 1818. When he took it over in 1856, it had about 350 members. In 1860, just 4 years later, it had about 2,000. The actual church building had burned down. The original one had burned down in 1854. The new one that they'd built just after he became the pastor was a 14th century Gothic cathedral, and as you can see, there have been a few changes to its political views. Fortunately, it's not all that hard for a pretty casual person like me to find out a fair amount about Mr. Palmer because you can see Dr. Christopher Duncan there was kind enough to write his doctoral dissertation on the gentleman. About a week before Palmer gave this sermon, Georgia Senator and very militant secessionist Robert Toombs had gone to New Orleans to try to drum up support in Louisiana for secession, where secession had not been outstandingly popular. He wasn't running into an awful lot of luck. Most of the political leaders he was trying to talk to weren't extremely enthusiastic, but then he had occasion to speak with Mr. Palmer a couple of days before this sermon was given. Once the sermon was given, the next day, the Daily Delta printed 30,000 copies in pamphlet that day. They printed 20,000 more copies over the next couple of days. 60,000 more pamphlet copies were printed elsewhere in the South. It was reprinted in newspapers all across the South, and it was apparently overwhelmingly the most read Southern religious document within many years on either side of its publication. So it was a massive publication and critical and political success. I don't really like boiling things down or simplifying them. I like the entire context, but I will go ahead and say as a spoiler that he believes that it is the divinely appointed task of the South to conserve and to perpetuate the institution of domestic slavery as now existing. All right, so here is the Thanksgiving sermon of Benjamin Morgan Palmer, November 29, 1860. He names as his texts Psalm 44:20, "Shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, which frameth mischief by a law?" And it means, shall the throne of iniquity, which frameth mischief by a law, have iniquity with thee? And he also names as his, subsidiary text, Obadiah 7, "All the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that ate thy bread have laid a wound over thee. There is none understanding in him." All right, he begins. "The voice of the chief magistrate has summoned us today to the house of prayer. This call, in its annual repetition, may be too often only a solemn state form. Nevertheless, it covers a mighty and double truth. It recognizes the existence of a personal God whose will shapes the destiny of nations, and that sentiment of religion in man which points to him as the needle to the pole. Even with those who grope in the twilight of natural religion, natural conscience gives a voice to the dispensations of providence. If in autumn extensive harvests hang their heavy head, the joyous reaper, crowned with the sickle and the wheaten sheaf, lifts his heart to the Father of lights, from whom cometh down every good and perfect gift. Or, if pestilence and famine waste the earth, even pagan altars smoke with bleeding victims, and costly hecatombs appease the divine anger which flames out in such dire misfortunes. It is the instinct of man's religious nature, which among Christians and heathen alike seeks after God, the natural homage which reason, blinded as it may be, pays to a universal and ruling providence. All classes bow beneath its spells, especially in seasons of gloom, when a nation bends beneath the weight of a general calamity and a common sorrow falls upon every heart. The hesitating skeptic forgets to weigh his scruples as the dark shadow passes over him and fills his soul with awe. The dainty philosopher, coolly discoursing of the forces of nature and her uniform laws, abandons for a time his atheistical speculations, abashed by the proofs of a supreme and personal will. Thus, the devout followers of Jesus Christ and those who do not rise above the level of mere theism are drawn into momentary fellowship, as under the pressure of these inextinguishable convictions they pay a public and united homage to the God of nature and of grace. In obedience to this great law of religious feeling, not less than in obedience to the civil ruler who represents this commonwealth in its unity, we are now assembled. Hitherto, on similar occasions, our language has been the language of gratitude and song. The voice of rejoicing and salvation was in the tabernacles of the righteous. Together we praised the Lord, that our garners were full, affording all manner of store, that our sheep brought forth thousands and 10,000s in our streets, that our oxen were strong to labor, and there was no breaking in nor going out, and no complaining was in our streets. As we together surveyed the blessings of providence, the joyful chorus swelled from millions of people, "Peace be within thy walls and prosperity within thy palaces." But today, burdened hearts all over this land are brought to the sanctuary of God. We see the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian do tremble. We've fallen upon times when there are signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming in the near yet gloomy future. Since the words of this proclamation were penned by which we are convened, that which all men dreaded, but against which all men hoped, has been realized, and in the triumph of a sectional majority, we are compelled to read the probable doom of our once happy and united Confederacy. And Confederacy was the United States of America until it got the title Union after the Confederate States of America kind of took the word Confederacy. It is not to be concealed that we are in the most fearful and perilous crisis which has occurred in our history as a nation. The cords which, during 4/5 of a century, have bound together this growing republic are now strained to their utmost tension. They just need the touch of fire to part asunder forever. Like a ship laboring in the storm and suddenly grounded upon some treacherous shoal, every timber of this vast confederacy strains and groans under the pressure. Sectional divisions, the jealousy of rival interests, the lust of political power, a bastard ambition which looks to personal aggrandizement rather than to the public weal, a reckless radicalism which seeks for the subversion of all that is ancient and stable, and a furious fanaticism which drives on its ill-considered conclusions with utter disregard of the evil it engenders. All these combine to create a portentous crisis, the like of which we have never known before, and which puts to a crucifying test the virtue, the patriotism, and the piety of the country. You, my hearers, who've waited upon my public ministry and have known me in the intimacies of pastoral intercourse, will do me the justice to testify that I have never intermeddled with political questions. Interested as I might be in the progress of events, I've never obtruded, either publicly or privately, my opinions upon any of you, nor can a single man arise and say that by word or sign have I ever sought to warp his sentiments or control his judgment upon any political subject whatsoever. The party questions which have hitherto divided the political world have seemed to me to involve no issue sufficiently momentous to warrant my turning aside, even for a moment, from my chosen calling. In this day of intelligence, I felt there were thousands around me more competent to instruct in statesmanship, and thus from considerations of modesty no less than prudence, I preferred to move among you as a preacher of righteousness belonging to a kingdom not of this world. During the heated canvass, which has just been brought to so disastrous a close, he means the election of 1860, the seal of a rigid and religious silence has not been broken. I deplored the divisions amongst us as being, to a large extent, impertinent in the solemn crisis which was too evidently impending. Most clearly did it appear to me that but one issue was before us, an issue soon to be presented in a form which would compel the attention. That crisis might make it imperative upon me as a Christian and a divine to speak in language admitting no misconstruction. Until then, aside from the din and strife of parties, I could only mature with solitary and prayerful thought the destined utterance. That hour has come. At a juncture so solemn as the present, with the destiny of a great people waiting upon the decision of an hour, it is not lawful to be still. Whoever may have influence to shape public opinion at such a time must lend it or prove faithless to a trust as solemn as any to be accounted for at the bar of God. Is it immodest in me to assume that I may represent a class whose opinions in such a controversy are of cardinal importance? The class which seeks to ascertain its duty in the light simply of conscience and religion, and which turns to the moralist and the Christian for support and guidance. The question, too, which now places us upon the brink of revolution, was in its origin a question of morals and religion. It was debated in ecclesiastical councils before it entered legislative halls. It has riven asunder the two largest religious communions in the land, that is to say, Methodists and Baptists. They split over the slavery question in the 1840s. His Presbyterian church was going to divide over the question in 1861. And the right determination of this primary question will go far toward fixing the attitude we must assume in the coming struggle. I sincerely pray God that I may be forgiven if I've misapprehended the duty incumbent upon me today, for I have ascended this pulpit under the agitation of feeling natural to one who is about to deviate from the settled policy of his public life. It is my purpose, not as your organ compromitting you, whose opinions are for the most part unknown to me, but on my sole responsibility, to speak upon the one question of the day, and to state the duty which, as I believe, patriotism and religion alike require of us all. I shall aim to speak with a moderation of tone and feeling almost judicial, well befitting the sanctities of the place and the solemnities of the judgment day. In determining our duty in this emergency, it is necessary that we should first ascertain the nature of the trust providentially committed to us. A nation often has a character as well defined and intense as that of the individual. This depends, of course, upon a variety of causes operating through a long period of time. It is due largely to the original traits which distinguish the stock from which it springs, and to the providential training which has formed its education. But however derived, this individuality of character alone makes any people truly historic, competent to work out its specific mission, and to become a factor in the world's progress. The particular trust assigned to such a people becomes the pledge of the divine protection, and their fidelity to it determines the fate by which it is finally overtaken. What that trust is must be ascertained from the necessities of their position, the institutions which are the outgrowth of their principles, and the conflicts through which they preserve their identity and independence. If, then, the South is such a people, so he's just been talking about how a nation can have a sort of an historical destiny imposed on it by its history, and so now he is asking, well, if the South has an historical destiny imposed on it by its history, if then the South is such a people, what at this juncture is their providential trust? I answer that it is to conserve and to perpetuate the institution of domestic slavery as now existing. He's only got the one destiny there. It is not necessary here to inquire whether this is precisely the best relation in which the hewer of wood and drawer of water can stand to his employer, although this proposition may perhaps be successfully sustained by those who defend it. Still less are we required dogmatically to affirm that it will subsist through all time. Baffled as our wisdom may now be in finding a solution of this intricate social problem, it would nevertheless be the height of arrogance to pronounce what changes may or may not occur in the distant future. In the grand march of events, Providence may work out a solution undiscoverable by us. Of course, any solution that you come up with will be the one that Providence has worked out. What modifications of soil and climate may hereafter be produced, what consequent changes in the products on which we depend, what political revolutions may occur among the races which are now enacting the great drama of history, all such inquiries are totally irrelevant because no prophetic vision can pierce the darkness of that future. If this question should ever arise, the generation to whom it is remitted will doubtless have the wisdom to meet it, and Providence will furnish the lights in which it is to be resolved. It doesn't seem to have crossed his mind that he is part of that generation, and he needs to actually come up with a solution of his own rather than just looking into the past. All that we claim for them and for ourselves is liberty to work out this problem guided by nature and God without obtrusive interference from abroad. These great questions of providence and history must have free scope for their solution, and the race whose fortunes are distinctly implicated in the same is alone authorized as it is alone competent to determine them. Right? So the issue of slavery in the South is something that the North should not fuss around with because that would be obtrusive interference from abroad. Rather, it should be determined by the race whose fortunes are implicated in it, by which he means Southern white people. Apparently, Southern white people have more competence to deal with slavery than, enslaved people. It is just this impertinence of human legislation, setting bounds to what God only can regulate, that the South is called this day to resent and resist. The country is convulsed simply because the throne of iniquity frameth mischief by a law. Without, therefore, determining the question of duty for future generations, I simply say that for us as now situated, the duty is plain of conserving and transmitting the system of slavery with the freest scope for its natural development and extension. Let us, my brethren, look our duty in the face. With this institution assigned to our keeping, what reply shall we make to those who say that its days are numbered? My own conviction is that we should at once lift ourselves intelligently to the highest moral ground and proclaim to all the world that we hold this trust from God, and in its occupancy we are prepared to stand or fall as God may appoint. If the critical moment is arrived at which the great issue is joined, let us say that in the sight of all perils we will stand by our trust, and God be with the right. So he is saying there that Southerners should, in general, be willing to die to preserve slavery. The argument which enforces the solemnity of this providential trust is simple and condensed. It is bound upon us, then, by the principle of self-preservation, that first law, which is continually asserting its supremacy over all others. Need I pause to show how this system of servitude underlies and supports our material interests, that our wealth consists in our lands and the serfs who till them, that from the nature of our products they can only be cultivated by labor which must be controlled in order to be certain, that any other than a tropical race must faint and wither beneath a tropical sun? Need I pause to show how this system is interwoven with our entire social fabric, that these slaves form parts of our households even as our children, and that, too, through a relationship recognized and sanctioned in the scriptures of God even as the other? Must I pause to show how it has fashioned our modes of life and determined all our habits of thought and feeling and molded the very type of our civilization? How then can the hand of violence be laid upon it without involving our existence? That is, he's saying that the end of slavery would be lethal to the South. The so-called free states of this country are working out the social problem under conditions peculiar to themselves. These conditions are sufficiently hard and their success is too uncertain to excite in us the least jealousy of their lot. With a teeming population which the soil cannot support, with their wealth depending upon arts created by artificial wants, with an eternal friction between the grades of their society, with their labor and their capital, he means their capitalists, their factory owners, people like that, grinding against each other like the upper and nether millstones, with labor cheapened and displaced by new mechanical inventions. Apparently it didn't occur to him that the cotton gin and the power loom were relevant to slavery at his point. Amid these intricate perils, we have ever given them our sympathy and our prayers and have never sought to weaken the foundations of their social order. God grant them complete success in the solution of all their perplexities. We too have our responsibilities and trials, but they're all bound up in this one institution which has been the object of such unrighteous assault through 25 years. If we're true to ourselves, we shall at this critical juncture stand by it and work out our destiny. This duty is bound upon us again as the constituted guardians of the slaves themselves. Our lot is not more implicated in theirs than is their lot in ours. In our mutual relations, we survive or perish together. The worst foes of the black race are those who have intermeddled on their behalf. So this is the 1860 version of outside agitators and communists came in, or nowadays the phrase is the Democratic plantation. We know better than others that every attitude of their character fits them for dependence and servitude. By nature the most affectionate and loyal of all races beneath the sun, they are also the most helpless, and no calamity can befall them greater than the loss of that protection they enjoy under this patriarchal system. Indeed, the experience has been grandly tried of precipitating them upon freedom which they know not how to enjoy, and the dismal results are before us in statistics that astonish the world. With the fairest portions of the earth in their possession and with the advantage of a long discipline as cultivators of the soil, their constitutional indolence has converted the most beautiful islands of the sea into a howling waste. So he's talking about Haiti, and we will come back to it shortly. It is not too much to say that if the South should, at this moment, surrender every slave, the wisdom of the entire world, united in solemn council, could not solve the question of their disposal. Their transportation to Africa, even if it were feasible, would be but the most refined cruelty. So there was this idea that some people had of just moving 4 million enslaved people out of the southern United States and back to Africa. This is obviously a terrible idea, as trying to send someone who was born in the United States, has lived their entire life in the United States, into a country that they've never lived in before is a really nasty thing to do to them. In this case, some people had this as a totally kind of racist idea. Some people thought this is what we're going to have to do in order to protect black Southerners from what eventually happened with so-called redemption at the end of Reconstruction, with the KKK and with Jim Crow. Unfortunately, people like Abraham Lincoln were in favor of this. So the guy was deeply compromised. Their residence here, in the presence of the vigorous Saxon race, would be but the signal for their rapid extermination before they had time to waste away through listlessness, filth, and vice. Right? So the claim is that if you abolish slavery, we will have no choice but to exterminate 4 million black people. Right? That's as obvious as it's humanly possible for someone to be. right? We're going to have slavery, he says, or else we will murder 4 million people. Freedom would be their doom, and equally from both they call upon us, their providential guardians, to be protected. That is, black Southerners are asking their white owners for protection both from being sent to Africa and also from living their own lives according to their own judgment. I know this argument will be scoffed abroad as the hypocritical cover thrown over our own cupidity and selfishness. Yes, it will. But every Southern master knows its truth and feels its power. My servant, whether born in my house or bought with my money, stands to me in the relation of a child. Though providentially owing me service, which providentially I'm bound to exact, that is to say, God made it so that the people that I enslave owe me something, and God made it so that I need to get it from them. Right? That's what providence is. Though providentially owing me service, which providentially I'm bound to exact, he is nevertheless my brother and my friend, and I am to him a guardian and a father. He's mixing his metaphors a little bit here. He's their brother, but he's also their guardian, and he's also their father, even though they are not his children and they are his brother. He's just going for every familial relationship he can possibly come up with here without any attention to the details of the metaphor. He leans upon me for protection, for counsel, and for blessing, and so long as the relation continues, no power but the power of Almighty God can come between him and me. Were there no argument but this, it binds upon us the providential duty of preserving the relation that may save him from a doom worse than death. So when he's telling Southern white people to die to preserve slavery, according to him, they're dying out of kindness to the people that they had been enslaving. It is a duty which we owe further to the civilized world. It is a remarkable fact that during these 30 years of unceasing warfare against slavery, and while a lying spirit has inflamed the world against us, that world has grown more and more dependent upon it for sustenance and wealth. Every tyro knows that all branches of industry fall back upon the soil. We must come, every one of us, to the bosom of this great mother for nourishment. In the happy partnership which has grown up in providence between the tribes of this confederacy, our industry has been concentrated in agriculture. And when he says industry, he means labor, their efforts. To the north, we have cheerfully resigned all the profits arising from manufacture and commerce. These profits they have, for the most part, fairly earned, and we have never begrudged them. We have sent them our sugar and brought it back when refined. We have sent them our cotton and brought it back when spun into thread or woven into cloth. And bear in mind that just a couple of pages ago, he was condemning the entire process by which cotton was woven into cloth because it was part of these newfangled machines that they got up north. Almost every article we use, from the shoe latchet to the most elaborate and costly article of luxury, they have made and we have bought. Both sections have thriven by the partnership as no people ever throve before since the first shining of the sun. So literally true are the words of the text addressed by Obadiah to Edom. All the men of our confederacy, the men that were at peace with us, have eaten our bread at the very time they have deceived and laid a wound under us. Even beyond this, the enriching commerce, which has built the splendid cities and marble palaces of England as well as of America, has been largely established upon the products of our soil, and the blooms upon southern fields gathered by black hands have fed the spindles and looms of Manchester and Birmingham not less than that of Lawrence and Lowell. Strike now a blow at this system of labor, and the world itself totters at the stroke. Shall we permit that blow to fall? Do we not owe it to civilized man to stand in the breach and stay the uplifted arm? If the blind Samson lays hold of the pillars which support the arch of the world's industry, how many more will be buried beneath its ruins than the lords of the Philistines? Who knoweth whether we are not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So here the claim is that they were willing to die to preserve slavery for the sake of northern factory workers and British factory workers. And what they found to their tremendous disappointment is that after the British oversupply of cotton had run out at the beginning of the war, the British just started importing all of their cotton from Egypt, and their economy barely took a hit. Last of all, in this great struggle, we defend the cause of God and religion. The abolition spirit is undeniably atheistic. So when people say that the Confederacy was a very religious place, bear in mind that religion and atheism are opposites. So the South was the opposite of atheism, but he has identified abolition with atheism, right? So he has identified the South and its version of Christianity as nothing other than slavery. So Southern defenders of Christianity were nothing other than Southern defenders of slavery. There was nothing else to their religion. The abolition spirit is undeniably atheistic. The demon which erected its throne upon the guillotine in the days of Robespierre and Marat, the French Revolution, which abolished the Sabbath and worshipped reason in the person of a harlot, yet survives to work other horrors, of which those of the French Revolution are but the type. Among a people so generally religious as the American, a disguise must be worn, but it is the same old threadbare disguise of the advocacy of human rights. Right? So he's saying, you abolitionists, you're just more those human rights activists. It's his version of the snowflake social justice warrior accusation. From 1,000 Jacobin clubs here as in France, the decree has gone forth which strikes at God by striking at all subordination and law. I mean, he's got a peculiar conception there of God. He thinks that God is the fact that he is in charge of the people that he enslaves. Right? That relationship of domination that he has, according to him, that is God. God exists in the social superiority of some people to others. Availing itself of the morbid and misdirected sympathies of men, it has entrapped weak consciences in the meshes of its treachery, and now at last has seated its high priest, Lincoln, upon the throne, clad in the black garments of discord and schism, so symbolic of its ends. Apparently Lincoln should have dressed more cheerfully. Under this specious cry of reform, it demands that every evil shall be corrected, or society become a wreck. The sun must be stricken from the heavens if a spot is found upon his disk. The Most High, knowing his own power which is infinite, and his own wisdom which is unfathomable, can afford to be patient. But these self-constituted reformers must quicken the activity of Jehovah or compel his abdication. Why it is that he doesn't think that the abolitionists are the means by which God is working out his plan in the world, he does not explain. In their furious haste, they trample upon obligations sacred as any which can bind the conscience. It is time to reproduce the obsolete idea that providence must govern man, and not that man should control providence. In the imperfect state of human society, it pleases God to allow evils which check others that are greater. As in the physical world, objects are moved forward not by a single force, but by the composition of forces, so in his moral administration there are checks and balances whose intimate relations are comprehended only by himself. But what reck they of this, where reck is short for reckon, but what reckon they of this, these fierce zealots who undertake to drive the chariot of the sun, working out the single and false idea which rides them like a nightmare? They dash athwart the spheres, utterly disregarding the delicate mechanism of providence which moves on, wheels within wheels, with pivots and balances and springs, which the great designer alone can control. So he says that abolitionism is both a single idea and a false idea. If it's a false idea, then it doesn't really matter that it's a single idea. I mean, you could just take it directly. What he wants to do is to say that it's false. And also, society is way too complicated for us to understand the consequences of abolishing slavery, so it would be terribly dangerous to do it, so we definitely don't want to. This spirit of atheism, which knows no God who tolerates evil, no Bible which sanctions law, and no conscience that can be bound by oaths and covenants, has selected us for its victims, and slavery for its issue. Its banner cry rings out already up in the air, liberty, equality, fraternity, which simply interpreted means bondage, confiscation, and massacre. This is the 1860 version of saying, oh, but you're the real fascists. With its tricolor waving in the breeze, that is the emblem of the French Revolution, it waits to inaugurate its reign of terror, also from the French Revolution. To the south, the high position is assigned to defending before all nations the cause of all religion and of all truth. In this trust, we are resisting the power which wars against constitutions and laws and compacts, against Sabbaths and sanctuaries, against the family, the state, and the church, which blasphemously invades the prerogatives of God and rebukes the Most High for the errors of his administration, which, if it cannot snatch the reins of empire from his grasp, will lay the universe in ruins at his feet. Is it possible that we shall decline the onset? Right, so he has just said there that abolitionism is opposed to all constitutions, laws, and compacts. It is against Sabbaths. So apparently if we end slavery, people will no longer take Sunday off. It is against sanctuaries. So apparently if we end slavery, we will burn down all the churches. Against the family, if we end slavery, there will be no more marriage. There will be no more husbands, wives, children. the state, so if we abolish slavery, we will have immediate anarchy, and the church, so again, if we abolish slavery, then there will be no more religion. That's quite a lot of things to hook to slavery there. So when the Southerners wanted to defend slavery, bear in mind that they identified slavery with constitutions, laws, compacts, Sabbaths, sanctuaries, family, state, and church. And then you can see why it is that even if you were not personally a slave owner, you would be perfectly happy to die to defend the institution, because that institution is identical for you with God, family, religion, and everything else, because it has been defined that way. This argument, then, which sweeps over the entire circle of our relations, touches the four cardinal points of duty to ourselves, to our slaves, to the world, and to Almighty God. Right? So it's a duty to themselves, because they will die without slavery, to our slaves, because the slaves will die without slavery, to the world, because the entire Western economy relies on cotton, and so it will collapse without slavery. They had a point, at least, with that one, in that the Western economy had relied upon Southern slavery, but then it turned out that they could just get their cotton from someplace else. And to Almighty God, right? So in preserving slavery, the Southerner considered that he was serving God by preserving slavery. It establishes the nature and solemnity of our present trust to preserve and transmit our existing system of domestic servitude with the right unchallenged by men to go and root itself wherever providence and nature may carry it. Now, that's quite the robust claim, since that means that if it goes wherever providence carries it, then it goes wherever it goes, since everything that happens is in accordance with the grand plan of God, and wherever nature may carry it. Now, that will include the entire rest of the hemisphere, right? The entirety of South and Central America was regarded as prime land for slavery. This trust we will discharge in the face of the worst possible peril. Though war be the aggregation of all evils, yet should the madness of the hour appeal to the arbitration of the sword, we shall not shrink even from the baptism of fire. If modern crusaders stand in serried ranks upon some plain of Esdraelon, there shall we be in defense of our trust, where, remember, the trust is to preserve slavery. Not till the last man has fallen behind the last rampart shall it drop from our hands, and then only in surrender to the God who gave it. Against this institution, a system of aggression has been pursued through the last 30 years. Initiated by a few fanatics who were at first despised, it has gathered strength from opposition until it has assumed its present gigantic proportions. No man has thoughtfully watched the progress of this controversy without being convinced that the crisis must at length come. Some few perhaps have hoped against hope that the gathering imposthume, that is a word meaning a pus-filled abscess, so this is his attitude toward the abolitionists. Some few perhaps have hoped against hope that the gathering imposthume might be dispersed and the poison be eliminated from the body politic by healthful remedies. But the delusion has scarcely been cherished by those who've studied the history of fanaticism and its path of blood and fire through the ages of the past. The moment must arrive when the conflict must be joined and victory decide for one or the other. As it has been a war of legislative tactics and not a physical force, both parties have been maneuvering for a position, and the embarrassment has been, whilst dodging amidst constitutional forms, to make an issue that should be clear, simple, and tangible. Such an issue is at length presented in the result of the recent presidential election. Be it observed, too, that it is an issue made by the North, not by the South, upon whom, therefore, must rest the entire guilt of the present disturbance. Right? If a Northerner hadn't won the presidential election, we wouldn't be having any of this problem. Therefore, the North is responsible for all of it because a Northern candidate won the election. With a choice between three national candidates who have more or less divided the votes of the South, the North, with unexampled unanimity, have cast their ballot for a candidate who is sectional, who represents a party that is sectional, and the ground of that sectionalism, prejudice against the established and constitutional rights and immunities and institutions of the South. So in the 1860 election, there was Lincoln, the Republican. The Democratic Party had split in two. They had basically a Northern candidate and a Southern candidate. And then there was a Constitutional Union Party that said, look, we don't really care about what we end up doing about slavery, just so long as we don't sunder the Union. So those other three kind of divided some of the Southern states, and they divided some of the Northern states enough that Lincoln won a solid victory across the North. So he won his electoral college victory partly because the Democratic Party had divided over the question of how firmly to support slavery. Right? And his claim is that the Republican Party is a northern sectional party, but what its sectionalism consists in is prejudice against the established and constitutional rights and immunities and institutions of the South, where the only institution that anybody's interested in is slavery. It's the only one that he's mentioned. What does this declare? What can it declare? But from henceforth, this is to be a government of section over section, right? North over south. A government using constitutional forms only, not the real substance of the Constitution, but just the structure of it. A government using constitutional forms only to embarrass and divide the section ruled. So the North is using the structure or appearance of the Constitution to divide Southerners against one another. And as fortresses through whose embrasures the canon of legislation is to be employed in demolishing the guaranteed institutions of the South. So the claim is that the new Republican administration will use the appearance of the Constitution to ultimately end slavery. What issue is more direct, concrete, intelligible than this? I thank God that since the conflict must be joined, the responsibility of this issue rests not with us, who have ever acted upon the defensive, and that it is so disembarrassed and simple that the feeblest mind can understand it. The question with the South today is not what issue shall she make, but how shall she meet that which is prepared for her? Is it possible that we can hesitate longer than a moment? In our natural recoil from the perils of revolution, with our clinging fondness for the memories of the past, we may perhaps look round for something to soften the asperity of the issue, for some ground on which we may defer the day of evil, for some hope that the gathering clouds may not burst in fury upon the land. It is alleged, for example, that the president-elect has been chosen by a fair majority under prescribed forms. That isn't just an allegation. I mean, that was true. But need I say to those who've read history that no despotism is more absolute than that of an unprincipled democracy, and no tyranny more galling than that exercised through constitutional formulas? But the plea is idle when the very question we debate is the perpetuation of that Constitution, now converted into an engine of oppression, and the continuance of that union, which is henceforth to be our condition of vassalage. I say with solemnity and pain, this union of our forefathers is already gone. So the claim here is that the election of Lincoln had already done away with the Constitution. As of the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Constitution was no longer in force. So, in leaving the United States, the southern states weren't really leaving, since the United States has already ceased to exist. It existed, but in mutual confidence, the bonds of which were ruptured in the late election. Though its form should be preserved, it is in fact destroyed. We may possibly entertain the project of reconstructing it, but it will be another union, resting upon other than past guarantees. In that we say, a new covenant we have made the first old, and that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. As a vesture it is folded up. For myself, I say that under the rule which threatens us, I throw off the yoke of this union as readily as did our ancestors the yoke of King George III, and for causes immeasurably stronger than those pleaded in their celebrated declaration. The only cause he has mentioned so far has been slavery. And you would imagine that had he been giving this sermon in 1776, he would have suggested that the American revolutionaries were Jacobinical, atheistical, opponents of all law, constitution, and religion. It is softly whispered, too, that the successful competitor for the throne protests and avers his purpose to administer the government in a conservative and national spirit. So Lincoln was really going out of his way to say, I am not an abolitionist. I am not going to try to abolish slavery. I completely acknowledge the legality and constitutionality of slavery where it exists. I say only that we are not going to allow slavery to extend into the territories, and we are not going to enforce the fugitive slave law. Right? So that is his conservative and national spirit. Allowing him all credit for personal integrity in these protestations, he is in this matter nearly as impotent for good as he is competent for evil. He is nothing more than a figure upon the political chessboard, whether pawn or knight or king will hereafter appear, but still a silent figure upon the checkered squares, moved by the hands of an unseen player. That player is the party to which he owes his elevation, a party that has signalized its history by the most unblushing perjuries. What faith can be placed in the protestations of men who openly avow that their consciences are too sublimated to be restrained by the obligation of covenants or by the sanctity of oaths? So the claim here is, Even though Lincoln says that he is not an abolitionist, still the Republican Party is plainly an abolitionist party. They're not going to abide by what he has said. Right? So the claim is the election of Lincoln was the election of abolitionism, even if it wasn't the election of an abolitionist. So no matter what Lincoln says about his goals, we still are going to secede to preserve slavery, which kind of goes to show why it is that when people quote Lincoln to try to figure out what the Southerners thought, they have made a mistake. If you want to figure out what the Southerners thought, you can ask the Southerners, and what they thought is that Lincoln was lying. No, we have seen the trail of the serpent 25 years in our Eden. Twined now in the branches of the forbidden tree, we feel the pangs of death already begun as its hot breath is upon our cheek, hissing out the original falsehood, "Ye shall not surely die." He's just likened abolitionism to the original sin in the Garden of Eden. Another suggests that even yet the electors, alarmed by these demonstrations of the South, may not cast the black ball which dooms their country to the executioner. So the Electoral College had not voted yet when he gave this, so apparently some people had the theory that the electors would throw the vote to somebody other than Lincoln. It is a forlorn hope. Whether we should counsel such breach of faith in them or take a refuge in their treachery, whether such a result would give a president chosen by the people according to the Constitution, are points I will not discuss, but that it would prove a cure for any of our ills, who could believe? It is certain that it would, with some show of justice, exasperate a party sufficiently ferocious, that it would doom us to 4 years of increasing strife and bitterness, and that the crisis must come at last under issues possibly not half so clear as the present. Right? So even if by some weird electoral mischance Lincoln were not to become the president, we're just going to have the same problem in 4 years, so let's go ahead and get it over with. Let us not desire to shift the day of trial by miserable subterfuges of this sort. The issue is upon us. Let us meet it like men and end this strife forever. But some quietist whispers yet further, this majority is accidental. It has been swelled by accessions of men simply opposed to the existing administration. That is, there are some people who have voted for the Republicans just because they don't care for the Democrats. The party, the Republican Party, is utterly heterogeneous and must be shivered into fragments by its own success. I confess frankly this suggestion has staggered me more than any other, and I sought to take refuge therein. Why should we not wait and see the effect of success upon a party whose elements might devour each other in the very distribution of the spoil? So the claim is, maybe the Republicans, they're not really held together by very much, so maybe they'll be totally ineffectual at governing, and so that party will splinter, and then we'll go back to a Democratic majority, and then we will not have an issue about slavery anymore. So why not just, let the Republican Party break apart and fail? Two considerations have dissipated the fallacy before me. The first is that, however mixed the party, abolitionism is clearly its informing and actuating soul. Right? So he says, look, however broken up the Republican Party might be, it is plainly an abolitionist party. That is a common thread running through all of its members. So abolitionism is clearly its informing and actuating soul, and fanaticism is a bloodhound that never bolts its track when it has once lapped blood. The elevation of their candidate is far from being the consummation of their aims. It is only the beginning of that consummation, and if all history be not lie, there will be cohesion enough till the end of the beginning is reached, till the dreadful banquet of slaughter and ruin shall glut the appetite. So the Republicans will hang together at least long enough to ruin everything. The second consideration is a principle which I cannot blink. It is nowhere denied that the first article in the creed of the now dominant party is the restriction of slavery within its present limits. It is distinctly avowed by their organs and in the name of their elected chieftain, as will appear from the following extract from an article written to pacify the South and to reassure its fears. He quotes from this article, "There can be no doubt whatever in the mind of any man that Mr. Lincoln regards slavery as a moral, social, and political evil, and that it should be dealt with as such by the federal government in every instance where it is called upon to deal with it at all. On this point there is no room for question, and there need be no misgivings as to his official action. The whole influence of the executive department of the government, while in his hands, will be thrown against the extension of slavery into the new territories of the Union and the reopening of the African slave trade. On these points he will make no compromise, nor yield one hair's breadth to coercion from any quarter or in any shape. He does not accede to the alleged decision of the Supreme Court that the Constitution places slaves upon the footing of other property, and protects them as such wherever its jurisdiction extends, nor will he be in the least degree governed or controlled by it in his executive action. He will do all in his power, personally and officially, by the direct exercise of the powers of his office and the indirect influence inseparable from it, to arrest the tendency to make slavery national and perpetual, and to place it in precisely the same position which it held in the early days of the Republic and in the view of the founders of the government. So that's what he thinks the Lincoln attitude towards slavery is going to be. Now, what enigmas, he continues, now, what enigmas may be couched in this last sentence, that is, we're going to return slavery to the position that it held when the Constitution was founded, something that everybody thought was going to fade away. What enigmas may be couched in this last sentence, the Sphinx which uttered them can perhaps resolve. But the sentence in which they occur is as big as the belly of the Trojan horse which laid the city of Priam in ruins. So the claim is nobody really knows what that thing means, but overall inside of it is destruction for the South. Right? So even though the Yankees say that they're not trying to abolish slavery, really they are. So we're going to go ahead and fight against what they're really going to do, not what they say they're going to do. These utterances we have heard so long that they fall stale upon the ear, but never before have they had such significance. Hitherto they've come from Jacobin conventicles and pulpits, from the rostrum, from the hustings, and from the halls of our National Congress, but always as the utterances of irresponsible men or associations of men. But now the voice comes from the throne, already before clad with the sanctities of office. Ere the anointing oil is poured upon a monarch's head, the decree has gone forth that the institution of Southern slavery shall be constrained within assigned limits. Though nature and providence should send forth its branches like the banyan tree to take root in congenial soil, here is a power superior to both, that says it shall wither and die within its own charmed circle. Right, so the claim here is God and nature want us to take slavery to other places than where it currently exists. Lincoln wants to stop us from doing that. Lincoln thinks that if we can stop the spread of slavery, it will gradually cease to exist within the southern states. So there's the shall wither and die within its own charmed circle. What say ye to this, to whom this great providential trust of conserving slavery is assigned? Shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, when it frameth mischief by a law? It is this that makes the crisis. Whether we will or not, this is the historic moment when the fate of this institution hangs suspended in the balance. Decide either way, it is the moment of our destiny. The only thing affected by the decision is the complexion of that destiny. If the South bows before this throne, she accepts the decree of restriction and ultimate extinction, which is made the condition of her homage. As it appears to me, the course to be pursued in this emergency is that which has already been inaugurated. Let the people in all the southern states, in solemn council assembled, reclaim the powers they've delegated. Let those conventions be composed of men whose fidelity has been approved, men who bring the wisdom, experience, and firmness of age to support and announce principles which have long been matured. Let these conventions decide firmly and solemnly what they will do with this great trust committed to their hands. Let them pledge each other in sacred covenant to uphold and perpetuate what they cannot resign without dishonor and palpable ruin. Let them further take all the necessary steps looking to separate and independent existence and initiate measures for framing a new and homogeneous confederacy. Thus, prepared for every contingency, let the crisis come. Paradoxical as it may seem, if there be any way to save, or rather to reconstruct, the union of our forefathers, it is this. Perhaps at the last moment the conservative portions of the North may awake to see the abyss into which they are about to plunge. Perchance they may arise and crush out forever the abolition hydra and cast it into a grave from which there will never be a resurrection. Thus, with restored confidence, we may be rejoined a united and happy people, but before God I believe that nothing will affect this but the line of policy which the South has been compelled in self-preservation to adopt. I confess frankly I'm not sanguine that such an auspicious result will be reached, partly because I do not see how new guarantees are to be grafted upon the Constitution, nor how, if grafted, they can be more binding than those which have already been trampled underfoot. Now, neo-Confederates like to talk about the Corwin Amendment. This was going to be an amendment to the Constitution that was going to specify that slavery could never be abolished in any of the states in which it currently existed. This was supposed to end the Southern agitation. But here we have someone saying, look, if we were to amend the Constitution so that the abolition of slavery were unconstitutional, that wouldn't make any difference. His theory is that the election of Lincoln has already effectively undone the Constitution. So the argument here is you can't trust the written document to preserve slavery. You're going to have the willingness of people in the North to support or at least tolerate slavery. Having lost the willingness, nothing that you write on a piece of paper is going to make any difference. So if you were to amend the Constitution in this way, it wouldn't actually help. Just like if Lincoln weren't actually going to be elected by the Electoral College, that would just help us kick the can down the road for a few years. This is going to happen. Either the Northerners have to give up abolitionism or else we have to separate from them. There's no other alternative. They can change the Constitution all they feel like changing it, but the will, the decisions of men are going to override it in the end no matter what. He continues, but chiefly because I do not see how such guarantees can be elicited from the people of the North. It cannot be disguised that almost to a man they're anti-slavery where they're not abolitionists. That is, there's abolitionists, and even the non-abolitionists are still anti-slavery. A whole generation has been educated to look upon the system with abhorrence as a national blot. They hope and look and pray for its extinction within a reasonable time and cannot be satisfied unless things are seen drawing to that conclusion. We, on the contrary, as its constituted guardians, can demand nothing less than it should be left open to expansion, subject to no limitations save those imposed by God and nature. I fear the antagonism is too great and the conscience of both parties too deeply implicated to allow such a composition of the strife. Nevertheless, since it is within the range of possibility in the providence of God, I would not shut out the alternative. Should it fail, what remains but that we say to each other calmly and kindly what Abraham said to Lot? Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. Thus, if we cannot save the union, we may save the inestimable blessings it enshrines. If we cannot preserve the vase, we shall preserve the precious liquor it contains. In all this, I speak for the North no less than for the South, for upon our united and determined resistance at this moment depends the salvation of the whole country. In saving ourselves, we shall save the North from the ruin she is madly drawing down upon her own head. The position of the South is at this moment sublime. Sublime means too big to really be comprehended by the mind. If she has grace given her to know her hour, she will save herself, the country, and the world. It will involve indeed temporary prostration and distress. The dikes of Holland must be cut to save her from the troops of Philip. But I warn my countrymen the historic moment, once past, never returns. If she will arise in her majesty and speak now as with the voice of one man, she will roll back for all time the curse that is upon her. If she succumbs now, she transmit that curse as an heirloom to posterity. We may for a generation enjoy comparative ease, gather up our feet in our beds and die in peace, but our children will go forth beggared from the homes of their fathers. Right? So either we prevent abolition now, or else our children will be impoverished. Fishermen will cast their nets where your proud commercial navy now rides at anchor and dry them upon the shore now covered with your bales of merchandise. And so if we abolish slavery, then we won't have any commercial shipping anymore. We'll just have fishing instead. Sapped, circumvented, and undermined, the institutions of your soil will be overthrown, and within 5 and 20 years, the history of San Domingo will be the record of Louisiana. So San Domingo is the capital of Haiti, so this is a reference to the Haitian Revolution. Haiti had a slave revolt. It lasted 13 years. It started in 1791, middle of the French Revolution, ran up to 1804 when finally Napoleon had about had enough. Haiti won its independence in 1804, but it was under essentially an embargo from France and other countries up to 1825. France agreed that they would go ahead and recognize Haiti, let them be integrated into the international economy, but for a fee. And the fee was 150 million gold francs. And I'm not completely sure how much that is, but near as I can tell, that is 75,000 pounds of gold. That is $1.8 billion in 2019 dollars. Haiti's gross domestic product now is $8.5 billion. So in 1825, they were asking for about 15% of the 2019 Haitian economy. It took until 1947 for Haiti to pay this off. So with an economy that first had been shattered by a war, and then had been crushed under an embargo, and then had been being leached from for over 100 years, it never did very well. And then the leadership class of Haiti after the revolution was basically an oligarchy that France had left behind. So this was what you find out when a small island country is brutally oppressed for well over a century, and it is not what you find from some kind of experiment in black self-governance. But anyway, this was the nightmare of the South, that South would turn into Haiti, and they just didn't notice or care about any of the ruthless imperialism that had actually been undermining Haiti for its entire known history. If dead men's bones can tremble, ours will move under the muttered curses of sons and daughters denouncing the blindness and love of ease which have left them an inheritance of woe. I have done my duty under as deep a sense of responsibility to God and man as I've ever felt. Under a full conviction that the salvation of the whole country is depending upon the action of the South, I am impelled to deepen the sentiment of resistance in the Southern mind and to strengthen the current now flowing towards a union of the South in defense of her chartered rights, and chartered rights are slavery rights. It is a duty which I shall not be called to repeat, for such awful junctures do not occur twice in a century. Bright and happy days are yet before us, and before another political earthquake shall shake the continent, I hope to be where the wicked cease from troubling, and where the weary are at rest. It only remains to say that whatever be the fortunes of the South, I accept them from my own. Born upon her soil, of a father thus born before me, from an ancestry that occupied it while yet it was a part of England's possessions, she is in every sense my mother. I shall die upon her bosom, she shall know no peril, but it is my peril, no conflict, but it is my conflict, and no abyss of ruin into which I shall not share her fall. May the Lord God cover her head in this her day of battle. All right, so you can see what Palmer thought the issue was. He thought that the issue was that the South had a divinely appointed mission to preserve slavery at all costs, and that it should secede for exactly that one particular purpose. He did not mention any other issues. In this entire sermon, which it took him 45 minutes to deliver, he mentioned one issue, and that was apparently quite the decisive issue, since this was one of the texts that actually moved the South towards secession. All right, so hopefully somebody's learned something. Good night.